Night over the Pacific was a living thing. The sea heaved black and silver beneath a sky without stars, and rain moved in slow curtains that swallowed light. Somewhere ahead, invisible beyond the storm, Japanese ships prowled the same dark waters. On the bridge of USS Spence, a Fletcher-class destroyer running at 28 knots, the captain stood in near total darkness. No searchlights, no flares, only the red glow of instruments and the murmur of voices from below decks. His binoculars were useless. The sea was just a wall of ink. Then, from the intercom, a calm voice spoke. "Contact. Bearing 087, range 12,000 yards. Multiple returns. Closing fast." It came from deep inside the ship, from a small windowless compartment just aft of the bridge. There, 6 men hunched over radar screens and grease pencil plots, tracing ghostly arcs that meant life or death. They were not officers of the deck, not gunners, not lookouts. Yet, in this war, they were the ones who saw first. In that room, the Combat Information Center, or CIC, the air was cold with sweat and humming equipment. Radar pulses painted green dots that drifted like phantoms across circular screens. A plotter's pencil marked their course. Another voice relayed bearings to the gunnery officer above. Enemy cruisers crossing port. Range 10,000. Recommend turn 20 degrees starboard. Fire control ready. The captain gave the order without hesitation. No one topside had seen the enemy, but the CIC had. Moments later, the darkness ahead erupted. Gunfire laced the horizon. Shells from unseen American guns finding their mark before the Japanese even realized they'd been detected. In seconds, the battle was over. The ocean was quiet again, except for the hiss of rain on hot metal. The destroyer's crew had fought the entire engagement by instruments, guided not by the eyes of men but by data, voices, bearings, and pulses bouncing off steel miles away. When the smoke cleared, a single truth emerged from that night. The U.S. Navy no longer fought in the dark. The world had entered a new kind of warfare, one where information, not vision, decided who lived through the night. And deep within those small, dimly lit rooms called Combat Information Centers, a revolution in naval warfare had quietly begun. The night belonged to Japan. Before radar, before the glowing green screens and calm voices, the night was chaos, and the Japanese Navy owned it. From 1941 to 1943, darkness on the sea meant death for American ships. The Imperial Japanese Navy had mastered the art of night combat long before Pearl Harbor. Its destroyer captains drilled for years under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's doctrine of Yasen Kessen, the decisive night battle. They trained to fight by instinct, using star shells, flares, and the moon to find their prey. Every officer knew his role. Every gun crew could load and fire by feel. In the black waters of the Solomon Islands, that training became terror. At Savo Island in August 1942, the Americans learned what that meant. Shortly after midnight, while Allied cruisers patrolled off Guadalcanal, Japanese heavy cruisers slipped through the darkness unseen. Without radar, American lookouts saw only faint silhouettes. In less than an hour, 4 Allied cruisers were burning: Canberra, Vincennes, Quincy, and Astoria. More than 1,000 men died, many without firing a shot. Survivors later said the Japanese ships appeared out of the night like ghosts. It was the same at Tassafaronga, Kula Gulf, and Kolombangara. Each time, Japanese destroyers, using their deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, struck first and disappeared before American guns could respond. They seemed to see through the dark. In truth, they did. The Japanese relied on sharp training, excellent optics, and night vision tactics refined since the 1930s. The U.S. Navy, by contrast, was unprepared. Its officers were taught to fight by daylight, to rely on visual contact and flag signals. Radar existed, but it was primitive, bulky, unreliable, and poorly understood. Ship captains distrusted it, preferring their eyes over the glowing screens below decks. The technology was there, but the doctrine wasn't. By late 1942, after repeated defeats, a phrase circulated among sailors in the South Pacific. "We own the day, but the night belongs to Japan." The Pacific was vast, but at night it felt claustrophobic. Ships could be yards apart and invisible. Gun flashes revealed positions. Flares gave away formations. Once spotted, a destroyer had seconds to live. Crews began to fear the dark more than the enemy. In the chaos of iron-bottom sound, wrecks piled up like tombstones. The Navy had no unified way to interpret radar reports. Every ship worked alone, scanning, guessing, shouting bearings across bridges already drowning in noise. There was no place where all that information came together. No brain to make sense of the eyes. It was not that America lacked courage or machines. It lacked coordination. The tools existed. The new SG surface search radar, the first reliable microwave set capable of distinguishing land from ships, but no one knew how to use it to fight a fleet action in darkness. Each ship had its own radar plot room, but communication between them was slow, confused, and often contradictory. The captain would glance at a scope, hear bearings from different talkers, and still not trust what he couldn't see. Battles were lost not because men failed, but because information did not flow fast enough to save them. By the end of 1942, that failure could no longer stand. In Pearl Harbor, the U.S. Navy's Tactical Analysis Section began dissecting every night battle minute by minute. Their conclusion was blunt. Victory at night demands centralized information control. The answer came not from admirals, but from junior officers and technicians, the radar operators, radio talkers, and gunnery plotters who understood what the machines could do. On a handful of forward-deployed ships, they began rearranging compartments, running extra voice lines, and pooling radar, sonar, and radio data into one room. It was crude at first: plywood tables, red lights, chalkboards, and tangle of headsets. But it worked. The new idea was simple yet revolutionary. Every sensor on the ship would feed into one central brain. From there, a trained officer would interpret, coordinate, and advise the captain in real time. They called it the Combat Information Center. The first experimental CIC appeared aboard USS Washington and USS Helena in early 1943. The results were immediate. Instead of conflicting orders and scattered reports, there was clarity. One plot, one voice, one picture of the fight. For the first time, a destroyer captain could command the night with confidence. It was the birth of modern naval command and control. By the summer of 1943, word of these rooms spread through the fleet. What began as an improvised experiment would soon become mandatory on every new destroyer, carrier, and cruiser leaving American yards. Within a year, the U.S. Navy, once blind in the dark, would fight with eyes that never blinked, and the ocean itself would begin to feel different. The night no longer hid the enemy. It revealed him. In pulses of green light, in whispers through headphones, in the rhythm of data turned into victory. The birth of the Combat Information Center. It began in rooms no bigger than a dining cabin, built from spare parts and improvisation. There were no official manuals, no blueprints, and no training schools yet. Only the instinct of sailors who knew they were fighting blind. On early warships like USS Washington, officers used chalkboards to track radar contacts, with mess tables serving as makeshift plotting surfaces. They called these spaces radar plot rooms or information centers. But in 1943, the name solidified: Combat Information Center, or CIC, a term first written in the after-action report of USS Helena after the Second Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. That night, radar operators on Helena tracked Japanese ships long before visual contact. They relayed range and bearing directly to gunfire control. For the first time in the Pacific War, an American ship fired first in total darkness. The difference was not better gunnery or luck. It was organization. The CIC turned scattered data into a synchronized picture. A fully equipped CIC was both primitive and prophetic. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of ozone from glowing cathode ray tubes. Red lamps illuminated plotting tables coated in wax paper where plotters marked each radar return with grease pencils. Around them, talkers wore throat microphones, relaying constant streams of bearings, speeds, and identification notes to bridge, gunnery, and engine rooms. At the center stood the CIC officer, often a lieutenant barely in his 20s, surrounded by 3 or 4 radar operators and radio men. He didn't command guns or engines. He commanded information. His job was to translate the rhythm of a dozen instruments into one coherent vision of the battle. When done right, it was like orchestrating a symphony inside a storm. The CIC concept spread rapidly after Admiral William Bull Halsey and Admiral Raymond Spruance saw its results firsthand during the Solomon Islands campaign. They ordered every destroyer and cruiser to install one, no matter how crude. The new idea was simple yet revolutionary. Every sensor on the ship would feed into one central brain. From there, a trained officer would interpret, coordinate, and advise the captain in real time. They called it the Combat Information Center. The first experimental CIC appeared aboard USS Washington and USS Helena in early 1943. The results were immediate. Instead of conflicting orders and scattered reports, there was clarity. One plot, one voice, one picture of the fight. For the first time, a destroyer captain could command the night with confidence. It was the birth of modern naval command and control. By the summer of 1943, word of these rooms spread through the fleet. What began as an improvised experiment would soon become mandatory on every new destroyer, carrier, and cruiser leaving American yards. Within a year, the U.S. Navy, once blind in the dark, would fight with eyes that never blinked, and the ocean itself would begin to feel different. The night no longer hid the enemy. It revealed him, in pulses of green light, in whispers through headphones, in the rhythm of data turned into victory. The birth of the Combat Information Center. It began in rooms no bigger than a dining cabin. Built from spare parts and improvisation, there were no official manuals, no blueprints, and no training schools yet. Only the instinct of sailors who knew they were fighting blind. On early warships like USS Washington, officers used chalkboards to track radar contacts, with mess tables serving as makeshift plotting surfaces. They called these spaces radar plot rooms or information centers. But in 1943, the name solidified. Combat Information Center, or CIC, a term first written in the after-action report of USS Helena after the Second Naval Battle of the Guadalcanal. That night, radar operators on Helena tracked Japanese ships long before visual contact. They relayed range and bearing directly to gunfire control. For the first time in the Pacific War, an American ship fired first in total darkness. The difference was not better gunnery or luck. It was organization. The CIC turned scattered data into a synchronized picture. The anatomy of a revolution, a fully equipped CIC was both primitive and prophetic. Inside, the air was thick with cigarette smoke and the scent of ozone from glowing cathode ray tubes. Red lamps illuminated plotting tables coated in wax paper where plotters marked each radar return with grease pencils. Around them, talkers wore throat microphones, relaying constant streams of bearings, speeds, and identification notes to bridge, gunnery, and engine rooms. At the center stood the CIC officer, often a lieutenant barely in his 20s, surrounded by 3 or 4 radar operators and radio men. He didn't command guns or engines. He commanded information. His job was to translate the rhythm of a dozen instruments into one coherent vision of the battle. When done right, it was like orchestrating a symphony inside a storm. The CIC concept spread rapidly after Admiral William Bull Halsey and Admiral Raymond Spruance saw its results firsthand during the Solomon Islands campaign. They ordered every destroyer and cruiser to install one, no matter how crude. The Bureau of Ships in Washington began issuing standardized diagrams, circular rooms with 360-degree plotting tables, radar repeaters on the bulkheads, and communication circuits labeled for every key station aboard. Training followed. At Pearl Harbor, a new CIC school opened in mid-1943 under Commander John D. Hayes. Students learned radar interpretation, information flow, and voice discipline. Instructors drilled them to remain calm under chaos, to speak in short, precise sentences that could steer a ship through blind battle. "No shouting," Hayes said. "Confusion kills faster than shell fire." By late 1943, a destroyer's CIC looked remarkably modern: glowing displays, headsets, and real-time tracking. The U.S. Navy had quietly invented situational awareness decades before the term existed. Machines, men, and doctrine technology alone didn't win the night. Trust did. At first, many captains resisted giving authority to unseen radar operators. To older officers raised on sextants and binoculars, the idea of fighting a battle from a dark room seemed absurd, even dangerous, but the war forced adaptation. Younger commanders, especially in the destroyer squadrons, began to rely on their CIC officers completely. Men like Commander Arleigh Burke, later famous as 31-Knot Burke, were among the first to recognize that speed and data could outthink any opponent. Burke's destroyers at Vela Gulf used radar and CIC coordination to stage the first successful radar ambush in naval history. The Japanese never saw them coming. Each radar contact, each plotting decision, fed into a doctrine of information warfare, decades before the term existed. The CIC became the destroyer's nervous system. The bridge was its face, the engine room its heart, the CIC its mind. By 1944, the system had matured into a network. Destroyers and cruisers shared radar data via voice radio circuits, forming what sailors called the TalkNet. One ship could detect, another could fire, a third could confirm, all in seconds. It was decentralized precision, a new kind of naval intelligence that allowed entire task forces to fight as one body in the dark. When the Fletcher-class destroyers began rolling off American production lines in late 1943, their CICs were designed into the blueprint, no longer an experiment but a standard feature. They included improved SG radar, plotting repeaters, and even primitive intership data coordination systems. Each destroyer carried a crew trained specifically for the information role: radar men, voice talkers, and CIC watch officers. By then, the Navy's manuals called the CIC the tactical brain of the ship. Its importance grew so rapidly that it changed the entire culture of naval warfare. No longer did command rest solely on what the captain could see from the bridge. It rested on what his team could know. Admiral Ernest King, reviewing the concept in late 1944, wrote, "The Combat Information Center has done for Naval Command what radar did for gunnery. It has made thought faster than sight." From there, the U.S. Navy would never again fight without one. By the time German officers toured American ships after the war, they were astonished not by the size of U.S. destroyers but by their brains. The humming rooms where sailors with pencils and headphones had turned chaos into choreography. It was in those cramped CICs, filled with quiet confidence and glowing glass, that America learned to see without seeing. And the night, once ruled by Japan, became a battlefield of order, light, and control. The human machine, voices in the dark. To step inside a World War II combat information center was to step out of time. There were no stars, no horizon, no wind. The sea existed only as movement on a plotting board, shifting lines of wax pencil. Yet, in that confined space, the fate of entire ships turned on the quiet coordination of a handful of men. They called it simply the room. To most sailors, it was a mystery. A red-lit cavern behind the bridge bulkhead where disembodied voices murmured bearings and distances into throat microphones. To those inside, it was a place of relentless focus. They lived in 3-minute worlds, the span of time between radar sweeps, between orders, between life and death. Communication inside the CIC was a form of ritual. Every word had weight, every pause could kill. The talkers spoke in clipped, monotone phrases that reduced chaos to geometry. Contact. Range 8,000. Bearing 210. Closing. Shift fire control to forward battery. Recommend course 270. There was no room for emotion, no slang, no uncertainty. The men were trained to be machines of clarity. Instructors at the CIC school drilled one phrase into them. Speak once. Be heard once. Be right. Each operator listened to multiple voices. Radar returns, sonar pings, voice circuits from other ships. Yet all spoke as one. The effect was eerie. In the heat of battle, the CIC sounded almost tranquil, its rhythm a heartbeat of calm within the storm. Up above, gun crews screamed over thunderous blasts. Below, the information flowed like blood through arteries. Most CIC teams were led by officers barely out of college, 22-year-olds commanding radar men older than themselves. They came from every corner of America. Farmhands, math students, engineers, radio hobbyists. Many had never seen the ocean before the war, but they shared a peculiar temperament. Calm under pressure, analytical, detached. They had to be. As one officer aboard the destroyer USS Callahan wrote in his journal, "We fight with lines and circles. Every mark is a ship, every ship is men. But we can't think about that, not until after." Their senses were narrowed to the glowing scopes. They learned to interpret the faintest quiver of a blip, the signature of a destroyer's fast turn, the slow drift of a damaged cruiser. They felt time stretch and contract as if the ship's pulse beat through the radar sweep. For some, the sensation was so total that after the war they reported phantom screens. The ghostly feeling of a radar trace still moving for the captain on the bridge, the CIC was both lifeline and gamble. He could not see what his radar men saw. He had to trust. That trust was not automatic. It had to be earned through hours of drills, shared danger, and unbroken accuracy. On USS Spence, Captain James Ennis described the moment he first fully believed in his CIC team. "They called 2 turns and 1 contact I couldn't see. Both saved us. I stopped doubting after that. In night engagements, that faith became doctrine. Orders flowed upward from the CIC and outward through the fleet. Destroyer captains began commanding based on information rather than instinct. Gunnery officers adjusted aim before visual contact. Torpedo spreads were fired on radar solutions alone. And when the guns spoke, they almost never missed. It was a psychological transformation as much as a tactical one. The CIC redefined courage, no longer the courage to charge what you could see, but to act decisively on what you could know. Silence and aftermath. When battles ended, the CIC stayed awake long after. The men cleaned plots, recalibrated scopes, and recorded logs in silence. Outside, the sea hissed against the hull. Inside, the adrenaline drained into exhaustion. The radar screens glowed faintly as though remembering the ghosts that had crossed them. In their stillness lay the essence of modern war, the separation between killer and contact, between man and machine. They had reduced the chaos of battle to lines of light, and in doing so, they had learned something both empowering and terrible. The more perfectly you understood war, the less human it felt. By 1944, these rooms of quiet precision were transforming fleets across the Pacific. They didn't make sailors braver. They made them smarter. Night no longer belonged to those with better eyes. It belonged to those who could think faster. And in that red-lit glow, war had found its new center, not on the bridge, not in the guns, but in the mind. By 1944, the Combat Information Center was more than a room. It was an ecosystem of sensors, circuits, and discipline. It fused the human and mechanical into one thinking organism, faster and more precise than any fleet that had ever gone to sea. From that moment forward, the U.S. Navy's destroyers were no longer just ships. They were data weapons. At the heart of every CIC pulsed a machine that changed everything, the SG radar. It was not the first radar set used at sea, but it was the first that could truly see the surface of the ocean. Operating at 10-centimeter wavelength, The SG's microwave beam could distinguish ships from waves and islands from clouds. Its screen, a glowing green circle called a Plan Position Indicator, PPI, gave a god's-eye view of the world around the destroyer, 360 degrees of moving light. Each sweep revealed returns as bright dots. Each dot represented a ship, a coastline, or death. To a trained operator, the SG turned night into geometry. A fast-moving return with a sharp arc meant a destroyer, a larger, slower echo, a cruiser or transport. Even in heavy seas, the radar could track targets at ranges up to 15 miles, long before visual contact. It ignored darkness, smoke, and rain. It was the ultimate impartial witness. But the SG alone wasn't enough. Its data had to be interpreted, compared, and turned into decisions, and that required a system that could think like a mind. Every CIC revolved around its plotting table, a circular surface coated in wax paper, constantly updated with new radar bearings and ranges. Two men stood at the board, marking the enemy's course with grease pencils, connecting lines, calculating direction and speed. Around them, runners shouted updated ranges, sonar readings, and friend or foe confirmations. This wasn't static data. It was alive. Every few seconds, new sweeps altered the picture. When plotted continuously, those dots formed trajectories, allowing officers to predict where the enemy would be in 1, 2, or 5 minutes. It was prediction, something no lookout could ever do. The CIC could see the future in motion. From those lines came gun orders, torpedo launches, and course changes. The room transformed radar sweeps into tactical foresight. In modern terms, it was the first digital network, except the processors were human minds moving faster than fear. A destroyer's CIC was tied into the ship by voice circuits, wired sound-powered phones connecting the CIC to the bridge, engine room, gunnery control, and other ships in the task group. These circuits had names like JG, gunnery control, JA, all stations, and 1JV, maneuvering. Each line had a talker, trained to speak with perfect clarity under fire. Through those lines, the CIC could command guns, torpedoes, and engines faster than the captain could even step outside. When multiple destroyers linked up via radio voice nets, information traveled from one CIC to another in real time. Entire squadrons began moving like a single organism. One ship detecting, another tracking, another firing. It was the birth of what sailors called tactical synchronicity, the ability for ships miles apart to act as if they shared one brain. By 1944, task forces in the Pacific were fighting this way routinely. A radar contact on one ship would instantly propagate through the circuit. Within moments, 3 destroyers would adjust bearing and open fire, all without seeing the enemy. Japanese officers, facing such coordinated speed, later described it as if the Americans were guided by invisible eyes. Once radar defined range and bearing, the CIC fed that data into the Mark 37 gun fire control system, a mechanical analog computer that could calculate firing solutions almost instantly. Linked directly to radar, it corrected for roll, wind, target speed, and elevation, continuously updating aim as the target moved. The result was devastating precision. Destroyers could open fire at night, in rain, even through smoke screens, and still score first-round hits. At Vela Gulf and Surigao Strait, Japanese cruisers were obliterated before they even knew they were under attack. The CIC had effectively merged man and machine into one decision loop. The captain no longer waited to see muzzle flashes. He fired the moment the CIC said to. The outcome was always the same. The enemy was already dying before he realized he'd been found. The soul, discipline, and design. Every machine inside the CIC worked only as well as the men trusted it. Training manuals stressed information discipline, the art of speaking, confirming, and verifying before acting. A false report could doom a ship. Every operator learned to check twice before relaying. Each voice became part of a system that relied more on integrity than hierarchy. For the first time, the U.S. Navy fought wars through distributed trust, captains trusting young officers they couldn't see, officers trusting invisible signals that pulsed through static and interference. It was mechanical faith, built on confidence in a process. This was the philosophy that separated American destroyers from all others. They weren't simply faster or stronger. They were organized through information. Each one was a floating network, a microcosm of what modern warfare would become. When German staff officers toured American ships after the war, they stood inside those small humming rooms and stared at the glow of the radar repeaters. One observer from the Kriegsmarine wrote simply, "The Americans have made thought itself into a weapon." And he wasn't wrong. The CIC was not just a piece of technology. It was the first battlefield computer, the first real-time command network, and the first step toward an age where victory would belong to whoever could think the fastest. When the night turned American. By 1943, the U.S. Navy had learned its lessons in blood. Every wreck at Iron Bottom Sound, every burning cruiser off Guadalcanal had taught the same truth. Whoever saw first would live. Now, with the combat information centers humming beneath their bridges, American destroyers were about to prove that truth on a scale the world had never seen. It began on a moonless night, in waters that had already swallowed too many ships. 6 American destroyers, Dunlap, Craven, Maury, Long, Sterrett, and Stack, slid silently through the calm blackness north of Kolombangara. Their mission: intercept a Japanese reinforcement convoy running troops to the island. The enemy had made the run countless times, always at night, always undetected. But this night was different. Each destroyer now carried a functioning CIC, with SG radar manned by trained operators and officers who knew how to fight by signal, not sight. At 11:28 p.m., the radar aboard Dunlap picked up faint contacts. 4 enemy destroyers approaching in formation. The CIC tracked their course, predicted their path, and within minutes had built a full picture of the enemy's movement. Range, bearing, speed, formation. Commander Frederick Moosbrugger, leading the squadron, didn't hesitate. He trusted the invisible picture before him. Torpedoes. Fire when ready. 36 American torpedoes streaked through the black water. On radar, the operators watched as the Japanese formation crossed the line of attack, and then the echoes blurred. A fireball blossomed on the scopes. 1, then 2, then 3 Japanese ships exploded. In less than 10 minutes, the Hagakaze, Arashi, and Kawakaze were gone. Not a single American ship had been hit. The battle was over before the Japanese even knew it had begun. A year later, the doctrine had become art. At Surigao Strait, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, American destroyers faced the largest Japanese surface fleet since Midway. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers steaming north under cover of darkness. Admiral Jesse Oldendorf's plan was simple and devastating. Cross the T. But the key to the trap was timing. Timing that depended entirely on radar and the CIC network. At 2:32 a.m., destroyers Melvin, McDermott, Remy, and Monson crept into position along the strait's flanks. In their CICs, radar screens flickered with hundreds of returns. Friendly, enemy, coastline, rain squalls, all moving in a luminous blur. Each operator filtered, tracked, and plotted, sending constant updates to the bridge. The CIC aboard Melvin confirmed the approach of 2 massive contacts, battleships Fuso and Yamashiro. Range 14,000 yards. Speed 18 knots. Bearing steady, the command to attack rippled across the net. At 3:00 a.m., the destroyers launched 27 torpedoes by radar solution. They never saw their targets. Aboard Fuso, the torpedoes struck seconds apart, 2, then 3, then 4 explosions tearing her apart amidships. Within minutes, the Japanese battleship broke in half and sank, taking more than 1,000 men down into the dark. The CICs guided every move, every calculation. When Oldendorf's battleships opened fire, they did so with radar-directed gunnery already locked onto the enemy. The Japanese fleet was annihilated before it could even return effective fire. The men in the CICs watched it unfold in silence, a battle fought entirely through blips and coordinates. "We never saw the enemy," one radar operator aboard Ramey later said. "Only the moment he stopped existing." Between Vela Gulf and Surigao Strait lay 100 smaller engagements. Destroyers dueling destroyers. Cruisers ambushed by coordinated formations that fought in the dark like wolves guided by unseen eyes. The Battle of Empress Augusta Bay, the Battle of Cape St. George, the countless convoy attacks across the Solomon Chain, each one sharpened the system. By 1944, a U.S. destroyer could detect, classify, and destroy targets faster than the Japanese could even maneuver. At Cape St. George, on November 25, 1943, 5 destroyers under Arleigh Burke intercepted a Japanese evacuation convoy. The CICs aboard Charles Osborne, Dyson, and Claxton plotted 5 enemy ships. They attacked from the dark, torpedoes guided purely by radar data. The Japanese lost 3 destroyers in 15 minutes. The Americans escaped without a scratch. The old fear was gone. The night, once haunted by unseen torpedoes and searchlight ambushes, now belonged to machines and men who had learned to trust them. By the end of 1944, every American task force operated as a network of CICs, hundreds of rooms across dozens of ships, linked by radio, plotting the sea like a living organism. The ocean had become a battlefield of information grids, each pulse of radar a neuron firing in the mind of a vast mechanical fleet. When the Japanese tried to reassert control with their Tokyo Express supply runs, they found nothing but death waiting. Destroyers already maneuvered into ambush positions hours in advance. The hunters had become prey, and they never understood how. From the Solomons to Leyte, the pattern repeated: calm voices, perfect geometry, and destruction without warning. The Americans no longer fought the night. They commanded it. And in those final months, as their radars swept through rain and flame, a new kind of warfare was being born, one that would never again rely on eyesight or chance. The visitors who finally understood the night. Summer 1945. Yokosuka Naval Base, Japan. The war was over. The sea, once choked with fire and noise, now lay still. Across the ruined harbor, the silhouettes of American destroyers rocked gently at anchor, machines that had crossed half the Pacific and come home triumphant. From the pier, a group of men in ill-fitting uniforms approached under guard. They were not prisoners in chains, they were officers, high-ranking staff from the Imperial Japanese Navy, and several observers from the German Kriegsmarine, brought to study how they had been defeated. These were men who had once believed themselves masters of the sea, who had fought their wars by calculation, by doctrine, by the precision of human sight. Now they stepped aboard USS Halsey Powell, a Fletcher-class destroyer that had survived more than a dozen engagements. The air smelled of oil and salt. The deck was clean, the brass polished, the crew silent but watchful. Below decks, a young American lieutenant led them into a narrow, dimly lit compartment. "This," he said simply, "is the Combat Information Center." The officers paused. The room was smaller than they expected. Circular, lined with glowing screens and black cables, its air humming faintly with the soft buzz of machinery. Red lights glinted off metal plotting boards. Headsets hung from hooks like coiled snakes. On one table lay a grease pencil still marking a track, a line of circles and arcs frozen mid-battle. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a German staff officer, a veteran of the Battle of the Atlantic, stepped forward. He peered at the radar repeater, its sweep slowly rotating. "It looks," he murmured, "like an aircraft controller's room." The American smiled. "That's not far off. Except here," he said, tapping the table. "Every dot is a ship, and every decision happens in seconds." A Japanese commander leaned close to the plotting board, studying the annotated markings. Ranges, bearings, course predictions. "You mean," he asked quietly, "your captain did not need to see the enemy?" "He didn't have to," replied the lieutenant. "He already knew where they were. Another officer asked about coordination. The American pointed to a set of intercom panels and voice circuits. Every ship had one of these, he explained. They all talked through their CICs. One detected, another fired, another confirmed. We could synchronize a whole squadron in darkness. The visitors exchanged glances. For years, their own ships had relied on shouted orders, bridge lookouts, and flag signals even in combat. The idea of fighting a coordinated battle in total blackout, guided entirely by information, was beyond their experience. One of the Germans, formerly attached to Admiral Dunnett's U-boat command, whispered almost to himself, "You fought the war from inside the machine." The American lieutenant nodded. "That's the idea. We made the ship think faster than the man." They toured the rest of the destroyer, the radar antennas, the fire control computers, the tangle of voice circuits connecting bridge, gunnery, and engine rooms. Everywhere, the same pattern appeared, systems designed for speed of thought. No wasted motion, no confusion. The ship was a network, not a hierarchy. When they returned to the CIC, one Japanese officer, a survivor of the Yamashiro's escort squadron at Surigao Strait, lingered behind. He stared again at the radar scope's rotating line, still sweeping its calm, steady arc. He had fought that night in darkness, surrounded by fire. He remembered how the American shells had found them again and again, invisible and perfect, as if guided by gods. Now, standing in that room, he understood. It hadn't been gods at all. It had been this. The glow of the radar reflected in his eyes as he whispered, "We never stood a chance." A month later, Allied intelligence officers compiled a report summarizing the visiting officer's impressions. The section on the U.S. Combat Information Center was blunt. German naval observers were unanimous in describing the CIC as the decisive advantage of American destroyers in night action. They noted that radar integration, voice discipline, and decentralized command transformed individual ships into components of a single coordinated system. They concluded that the U.S. Navy had achieved mechanical unity of command, a fleet that could think as one mind. The phrase struck the reviewing officers in Washington. Mechanical unity of command. It was more than flattery. It was truth. The CIC had turned information into a weapon, transforming chaos into choreography. Yet even as they admired it, some Americans understood the cost. The more perfect the system became, the further the sailor drifted from the sea itself. Men who had once fought by instinct and moonlight now fought by echo and pulse. They spoke through wires, saw through glass, killed by geometry. They no longer felt the ocean's rhythm. They felt the machines. In letters home, radar officers often wrote of strange dreams, of glowing dots that moved endlessly across dark circles, of battles that played out long after they'd left the ship. They had learned to fight in a new way, but the memory of that light, that eerie, humming calm, stayed with them forever. By the time the German and Japanese officers left the ship, the night had fallen again over Yokosuka. The sea outside was quiet, reflecting the distant lights of the anchored destroyers. One of the visitors turned back before descending the gangway. "Tell me," he asked softly, "how did your captains learn to trust this?" The American answered without hesitation. "We stopped trusting what we could see." The brain of the fleet. How information replaced instinct. When the war ended, the U.S. Navy's destroyers returned home with scarred hulls and glowing reputations. But deep inside each of them, in the dim red light of their combat information centers, lay something far greater than a wartime advantage. It was the blueprint for the future. The Navy had entered the war as a force of ships. It left the war as a force of systems. Within weeks of Japan's surrender, the Navy's Bureau of Ships began collecting data from every CIC in the Pacific. They interviewed hundreds of radar officers, plotters, and captains, compiling a new kind of combat report. Not about gunnery accuracy or ship speed, but about information flow. The conclusion was stark and universal. Victory in the Pacific was achieved not by superior firepower, but by superior coordination of information. For the first time in naval history, A weapon of command had outperformed a weapon of destruction. That realization reshaped everything. The CIC was no longer a wartime improvisation. It became the core of naval design. Every new ship class planned after 1945, destroyers, cruisers, carriers, placed its information center at the heart of the vessel, connected to radar, sonar, and radio by direct lines. No longer was the captain a lone figure on the bridge. He was the conductor of an orchestra of data. As the world slid into uneasy peace, the U.S. Navy faced a new adversary, the invisible battlefield of surveillance and speed. The CIC, born in East-Dubai, the crucible of the Pacific, evolved into the Combat Direction Center, CDC, a larger, more complex room capable of processing multiple radar and sonar inputs simultaneously. Where once sailors plotted lines with grease pencils, now they worked with transparent overlays, projected maps, and electronic repeaters. The same concept, centralized information, decentralized execution, guided new fleets across the world's oceans. During the early Cold War, when Soviet submarines began prowling the Atlantic, the Navy realized that every engagement would begin with detection, not gunfire. Every task force, convoy, and patrol now operated as a network of information, a living descendant of those wartime destroyers. Even the naval command centers of Washington and Pearl Harbor were modeled after CIC layouts. Dark rooms, glowing screens, calm voices coordinating chaos from thousands of miles away. The ocean had become digital before the word existed. The philosophy of the CIC, coordination through shared awareness, soon migrated beyond ships. The newly formed U.S. Air Force adopted its principles for air defense networks. The first radar warning centers of the 1950s were, in essence, CICs on land, circular rooms of glowing scopes linked by voice lines and teleprinters. Even the early NORAD command posts buried under mountains carried the same lineage: centralized awareness, real-time control, and calm decision-making under pressure. Historians would later trace a direct line from those destroyer rooms to everything that followed: computer command centers, satellite networks, digital warfare. In 1943, it had been a few men in headsets and headphones. By 1963, it was the nervous system of the free world. Yet, for the men who had lived through it, the memory remained tactile and human. They remembered the hum of the equipment, the smell of sweat and ozone, the quiet intensity before a battle began. The CIC had taught them a truth that no textbook could, that courage in modern war was the ability to think clearly faster than fear could move. Radar operator Earl McCown, who served aboard USS Charles Osborne, said years later, "When people ask if we were brave, I tell them no. We were trained. The machines made us calm. You don't fear what you can see on the screen. You fear what you can't." That discipline, that serenity under pressure, became the defining ethos of the post-war Navy. The CIC was no longer a dark room full of blinking lights. It was a philosophy. Know first. Decide fast. Act cleanly. By the 1950s, the phrase CIC doctrine appeared in every Navy training manual. Its lessons shaped not only ships, but people. From sonar operators in the Arctic to flight controllers guiding jets over Korea. The war had created a generation of sailors who understood that power came not from shouting louder, but from thinking together. And as new wars rose on new horizons, they carried with them the quiet hum of the room that had taught the world how to fight without fear of the dark. The invention of the thinking fleet. The destroyers that had ruled the night carried home more than victory. Inside their steel hulls, they carried the seed of a new civilization, one that understood that the greatest power was not strength, but awareness. The Combat Information Center, born out of desperation and darkness, would evolve into the nervous system of modern warfare. In the years after 1945, the CIC's design was studied with the same reverence once given to gunnery or propulsion. Naval architects redrew blueprints around it. Instead of building ships and then adding sensors, they began building ships around information. Destroyers of the Forrest Sherman class in the 1950s placed the CIC at the exact center of the hull, both symbolically and functionally. From that core ran cables, radar lines, and sonar feeds like veins. The ship's captain now fought not from the bridge but from within the CIC, the brain surrounded by nerves. And the brain itself was evolving. Paper plots became illuminated plexiglass. Voice relays gave way to early computers. By the late 1950s, the U.S. Navy introduced the Naval Tactical Data System, NTDS, the first true digital command network. Every radar return, sonar ping, and weapon status fed into screens that updated automatically. For the first time, a ship could think in binary. It was the direct descendant of the wartime CIC, the same concept now reborn in silicon. What had begun in one dim destroyer room now stretched across oceans. By the 1960s, American carriers, submarines, and destroyers were linked by encrypted data lines. A contact detected in the North Pacific could appear seconds later on a cruiser's plot in the Indian Ocean. The world's largest fleet had effectively built a distributed nervous system. This was the Navy that entered the nuclear age, one that didn't rely on heroism or instinct but on information synchronized at the speed of light. The CIC's logic became the foundation for satellite communication, missile defense, and global positioning systems. Every new technology, from sonar grids to space-based radar, flowed through the same idea: perception, coordination, action. When the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in 1962, the Pentagon's war rooms were laid out almost identically to a 1944 destroyer CIC, circular plotting tables, red lighting, calm voices reading coordinates. The lineage was unmistakable. The room that had once guided torpedoes in the Solomons now guided the fate of nations. But the legacy of the CIC was not only technological, it was psychological. It changed how commanders thought. Before the CIC, leadership at sea meant intuition, standing on a bridge, reading the wind, trusting the gut. After the CIC, leadership meant integration, trust in systems, in data, in other minds working in parallel. It demanded humility. A captain could no longer win a battle by himself. He needed to become part of the network. He had to believe. In voices he couldn't see, in machines he couldn't fully understand. That kind of trust required a new kind of courage, the courage to let go of the illusion of control. Naval historian E.B. Potter would later write, "The Combat Information Center marked the end of the heroic age of command and the beginning of the analytical age. From then on, victory belonged to those who could think collectively." That cultural shift spread beyond the Navy. Air defense controllers, nuclear command officers, even astronauts trained under CIC-derived doctrines of communication and calm precision. When Apollo 11 landed on the Moon in 1969, its Mission Control Center in Houston echoed the destroyer CIC in form and spirit, the same circular data flow, the same composed voices, the same unflinching clarity under stress. By the 1970s, few of the original radar operators were still serving. Many had retired to quiet lives, but the memory never left them. Some visited museum ships and found their old CICs preserved behind glass. The wax plotting tables, the radar repeaters, the smell of dust and paint. Standing in those rooms, again they said it felt smaller than they remembered, smaller and quieter. Yet the echoes of their work reached farther than they could have imagined. Modern naval officers who guided drone fleets, coordinated missile strikes, or tracked submarines under polar ice were still living inside their invention. The philosophy was unchanged: gather everything, see everything, act together. The ocean they once fought upon had become digital, filled with sensors, satellites, and invisible currents of data, but it was still the same sea that had taught them to fight by pulse and patience. The CIC had not conquered the ocean. It had merged with it. The night that once belonged to the enemy had become a permanent ally. From the radar hum of the 1940s to the networked fleets of the 21st century, the same quiet idea endures: that understanding is stronger than fear, that connection is stronger than chaos. The destroyers had not just ruled the night. They had redefined what it meant to see. The war ended 8 decades ago, but in the quiet hours before dawn, the Pacific still sounds the same. The waves rise and fall against forgotten harbors. The wind moves through empty decks where radar once hummed, and somewhere beneath that endless dark, the sea still carries the memory of light. Faint, pulsing, circular. In those rooms with no windows, the men of the U.S. Navy learned something eternal: that when the German and Japanese officers stepped into those rooms in 1945, they saw not just technology, but transformation. The moment when war left the body and entered the mind. The destroyers no longer hunted with eyes and guns. They hunted with thought, coordination, and faith in the invisible. That was the true weapon of the night. Everything that came after, the command centers, the satellites, the data networks that gird the world, began there, in red light and cigarette smoke, where young men plotted bearings that would define an age. Their creation became the language of every fleet that followed, the silent hum behind every calm voice guiding others through uncertainty. Today, the ocean covers their traces. The destroyers are gone, the blips long vanished, yet the sea remembers. If you listen long enough to the wind, you can almost hear it. The soft pulse of a radar sweep turning in the dark, the voice that says quietly, "Contact bearing 087. Range 12,000. Closing. The battle is over, but the lesson remains. To see clearly, even in darkness, is the beginning of every victory."